This week, as we go through the AAUW um, data, right? They've done a great job. The American Association of University Women, all the wage gap data that they have gathered over the years. It can be tough and it can be really, really demoralizing. But because that exists and persists, I we spend the beginning of our work together this week looking at what do we even value in the workplace in the first place, and how does gender layer over that when we go back to that stereotype list that you all put together. Where do we see what is valued in the workplace? Because I think that starts to, I guess I don't want to say answer, but starts to give us a place to understand. I don't know. I don't even like the word understand because it's so infuriating. The inherent unfairness of the wage gap is so infuriating. So I don't, do we want to understand? I suppose you need to start to understand the infuriating inequalities, because otherwise, if we ignore them or if we're oblivious, how are they ever going to change? And so we very much take a look at the workplace in general in relation to gender before we start to kind of examine some of this. So, a few more little bits and pieces about that. The concept of emotional labor. So, if you think about the ideal worker and the ideal worker in different industries, where do you see something that's emotional labor? Emotional labor is defined as making people feel comfortable, right? The big smile. Hi, hi, welcome in. Hi, how are you today? Hi, thanks for being here. Hi, how can I help you? A lot of service industry stuff has emotional labor. A lot of education, though, has emotional labor too. Nursing, which I know many students want to pursue, that has an inordinate amount of emotional labor. Is emotional labor oftentimes coded as kind of that nurturing femininity? Possibly, not always, but kind of thinking about what careers, what areas require that level of emotional labor, that like level of like caring and interaction and being responsible for people's feelings. So that comes in two ways. The first one is that big smile, right? Hi, hi, thank you so much. What can I do for you? Um, that surface level. But then we also have to like regulate ourselves. That deep level emotional labor, like, I don't know, you can't have a headache. You can't be exhausted. You can't be impatient because you've answered the same questions 75,000 times. The customer's always right. That kind of stuff. And so thinking about where does gender layer into those kinds of expectations in various careers, right? So, um, as I've said, we're going to be digging into so many stats, and I don't want to. I'm not a fan. I could, as a like teacher, I guess, be like, and then this stat says this, and then that stat says that. I will tell you, I think my most like, excuse my language, but I'm sorry, like, holy shit, uh, like, fact that comes out of the AAUW data is the year that like pay equity could possibly be reached. I don't have it in front of me right now, but like how it has an adjusted timeline because everything is stagnated to the point where the original kind of timeline was like, well, I'll be ancient, but you'll still be kind of getting to the end of your career because you're, 25-ish years younger than I am. But like the adjusted timeline in like 2100 something, we'll be dead. I believe it was stated in a way that like, we will have human beings on Mars before reached pay equity here on Earth. That's why to me that's one of the ones that's just like, I don't know, all the bad words, all the bad words. A lot of times when we talk about the wage gap widely in society, we say, oh, well, women are being paid 78 cents or 83 cents, 82 cents to the dollar, to every dollar a man makes. But we learn with the AAUW data that that's not accurate, right? That you layer in racial identities, you have that moment of intersectionality, and the world looks like a very, very, very different place. If you ever pay attention, sometimes on social media, you will see various accounts sharing equal pay day. And if you go and if you Google it right now, equal pay day is very, very different for different women based upon their racial identity. And sometimes it's always dire, but sometimes it is just outrageously dire. That term intersectionality, which we discussed a few weeks ago, if you actually do some research into Kimberly Crenshaw and the author of intersectionality, she developed this concept within the workforce. It was because of somebody seeking out legal assistance because of workforce discrimination, that she was not being hired, even though the company's like, we hire women. And she was not being hired as a Black woman, even though the company was like, we hire people who are Black. They weren't hiring Black women. And that's where Kimberly Crenshaw conceptualized the idea of intersectionality. That intersection of those identities created this specific discrimination in the workplace. And so we see that continuing in the wage gap. We see that intersection of race and gender identity continuing the wage gap. I think one of the other things, it's not one of the charts in the AAUW data, but I believe it's like in maybe the original like 2018 report or something, that gender identity in relation to people who identify as trans, people who are biologically male and are a trans woman, um, their pay in that transition goes down, and vice versa. People who were born biologically a female but are a trans man, their pay can go up. And so it's interesting how it persists. The other thing too, I'm just going to keep talking about the data because the data is fascinating. I hope you caught this stuff. When they have controlled for people who work in the same industry, they work for the same number of years, they work in the same, geographical area, because, we're going to get paid more here in Southern California because everything costs $1 billion. Like when they control for all of that, it still persists. Last one is, this is all coming off the top of my head. This is because I've kind of memorized a few of these things over the years because they're so infuriating. You think education, right? Education will solve this? No, not that either. I would really encourage you, um, because this doesn't just mean dollars and cents, right? The AAUW, if you dig around on that website, they also talk about like ways to negotiate your pay, things to say in an interview and not say in an interview. Like if you're being asked, what did you make at your last job? They can utilize that to then basically continue discriminatory practices, things along those lines. So kind of keeping that in mind in relation to gender identity and the persistence of the wage gap. So I just said, we're, getting away a little bit from dollars and cents, and I'm leaving you with this particular long but really interesting um, quote from Dr. Brittany Cooper. But we're actually going to end on dollars and cents. So imagine the wage gap is only 1 penny. It's only 1%. It's 1 penny, right? It's just 1% difference. Imagine this day in the future. Apparently, it's going to be in like 2672 or some year that we can't even imagine. But imagine if it was only 1%. So right now, the median men's earnings per year is $66,790. Let's do some math. We're ending basically with math class here. Okay. So you times that by a 35-year career. I'm just kind of throwing that number out there, but right? Okay. So that ends up meaning in a lifetime you earn $2,337,650. Okay, so let's imagine that the wage gap is just 1 penny. It's just 1%. It's this tiny little minuscule, right? Does a penny matter? Well, if you take 1% of that $2,337,650, it ends up being $23,000. I mean, come on. What could you pay for with $23,000? At least a couple years still, sort of. Not with room and board or like renting an apartment, but tuition at a CSU isn't quite that disgustingly high yet, right? Um, while cars will be going up in price like many things in our society, yeah, still, right? At least a maybe nice used car. Hopefully, like maybe getting real close to like a low end new car. That'd be cool. I don't know, like being able to invest $23,000 that it can sit, growing and kind of outliving the ups and downs of our financial markets. Uh, Putting it towards the down payment on owning a condo, a home, like $23,000 could go a long way and make a big difference. And so even if the wage gap today was just 1 penny over a lifetime of working, over a career of working, it still ends up being an impactful amount of money. So when we're saying it's 82 cents, it's 63 cents, it's 54 cents, start to really, really, really see and feel the devastation of that. A lot of times this semester, maybe when we talk about beauty, we talk about second shift and all the work there's moments in gender consistently where you kind of scream out, like, why is society like this? And I almost think that as we head towards this end of the semester, that this is one of the ones. But I don't want to leave you on that entirely. I don't want to be like, well, you're screwed. We all are. Because what does that do? We're going to head towards the last topic in this semester, and it's all about kind of social change and how do you make social change and how do you contribute to it. Like I said, if you get the chance, and I know you're busy, finals are approaching, like life and all of its stressors, I totally understand. But we also, I think, all of us, myself included, we'll spend some time going down social media, kind of, zoning out, I guess, doom scrolling, as they say now. Maybe take a little bit of that time and do some different Googling instead. And not necessarily learning more about the wage gap. You've learned it's dire, but learning the techniques and skills and the strategies, being incredibly strategic. The strategies are out there, and you're going to take them and you're going to kick ass.